Hello. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm delighted to introduce Stephen Coleman from the University of Leeds. Recent publications include Leaders in the Living Room, a study on the leadership debates in the 2010 election. Also done a lot about internet and democracy. And yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Every case, every situation has a background. It has a context which is both historical and discursive. And if you don't understand the historical and the discursive context of the situation, you will not understand the situation. The historical context of any situation is the configuration of temporal and spatial forces that define the scope for action. So if something happens in the Middle Ages, we think about it in a different way from it happening in the 21st century. Something happens in a part of the world in which vast numbers of people are dying of poverty, we think about it in a different way from a part of the world in which people are engaging in disputes about whether gay marriage should be legalised. And also, there is a discursive context to every question. The discursive context describes what kind of words we use to say certain things. What has been said before the story begins? What is permissible to say? What is the obvious? What is the peculiar? What is likely to be learned from this situation, and what cannot be learned from this situation? And so I want to spend a little bit of my time and yours talking about the context of the internet in politics. And I want to suggest that what we call the internet, and let me define the internet, as a network of networks through which people communicate regardless of the hard technologies that they are using to do it. Computers, laptops, mobile telephones. It's a network of networks which are interdependent but not coordinated. And the internet disrupts political communication as we have understood it for the 100 years before the internet came along. Before then, we always thought about political communication consisting of three elements, a kind of triangle. There were politicians who were sending out their messages. There were voters, citizens, people who are receiving the messages and sometimes sending them back. But in between, there are journalists who are mediating the message, who are interpreting the message. And what the internet does in terms of political communication is it changes the terms of mediation, because it is possible not only for politicians to directly speak to citizens and voters, but for citizens and voters to directly speak to their political leaders. Now, in the early days of the internet, and I was one of the first people to be writing about the internet and politics in this country, and Brian Roder was another one of the first ones, we encountered a number of people, strange as it may seem to those of you sitting here now, who actually said, if we ignore or dismiss the internet as a political phenomenon, it might go away. I mean, I think, for example, of a government minister in Britain that I was speaking to in 1998, and he said, why should this newly elected Labour government be interested in the internet? After all, how many people have got the internet in their homes in Britain? This is 1998. Does anyone want to have a guess how many percentage of the population had the internet at home in 1998? it was 2%. So I said, 2% have got the internet in their homes. And he said, 2%? Why on earth should we be interested in a technology that 98% of people haven't got? And I said, because many of us think that within as little as 5 years from now, more than half of them will have it. And actually, that was right. Right now, it's somewhere between 70 and 80% who have some form of home access to the internet. So while the original reaction to the internet on the part of some people was ignore it, it will go away, as was the original reaction, incidentally, to television, as was the original reaction to the printing press by some people, this clearly was not going to endure historically. The second kind of response to the internet was to try to institutionalize it. The argument was, well, look, you've got the internet, it's coming along, let's use it to do exactly what we were doing before. So we try and kind of reshape the internet to do things as inefficiently, as unfairly, as slowly as we'd always done it, and then the internet will be doing a good job. So what governments would say is, we want people to pay their taxes online. But to pay their taxes online, they should be doing all the same kind of stages that they had to do when they originally were paying their taxes through the post. So you get the replication of institutional procedure. But at the same time as these great worries about the internet, assumptions that the internet might go away, beliefs that the internet was something peripheral to everyday life, there were what I would call hyperbolic expectations. Hyperbolic expectations were expectations by people who said, the internet is going to change absolutely everything. So, for example, we get a man called Dick Morris. Anyone know who Dick Morris was? He was Bill Clinton's chief strategic advisor. So he was a serious guy. During the Clinton presidency, he was one of the 3 most important people in the White House. After that period, Morris decided to become an evangelist for the internet. And this is what he says. Whether direct internet democracy is good or bad is quite beside the point. It is inevitable. And Morris had this idea that everyone will be voting, using their computers on every issue that faces them, local through to global. Same kind of argument comes through from Al Gore. Remember that famous speech? He was the Vice President of the United States. This wasn't some sort of eccentric sitting in a Californian Silicon Valley company dreaming the dream. This was the Vice President of the United States. The global information infrastructure will not only be a metaphor for a functioning democracy, it will in fact promote the functioning of democracy by greatly enhancing the participation of citizens in decision making. The European Union, never willing to be outdone when it comes to wrong predictions, says this: the new information technologies may, for the first time in the history of industrial societies under liberal regimes, make it possible to recreate the perfect information arena, the agora of ancient Greece, a meeting place where citizens could go to be fully informed and participate directly, and so on and so forth. And this notion, this set of visions, this kind of utopianism, was abundant in the late 1990s, and one would go to conferences or go to listen to talks not dissimilar to this talk and hear people standing there saying, government as we know it will disappear, we won't have parliaments anymore, we won't have political parties, we will have some form of push-button internet democracy. And some of those views were coming from the very top of the political elite. Why were people turning in this direction? One of them was because the emergence of the World Wide Web as a public network in the middle of the 1990s coincided with one of the greatest crises of anxiety around political disengagement and disenchantment. And in the mid-1990s, political elites all over the world began to worry that people were not going out to vote for them, that when they did vote for them, they didn't believe they would do anything that they said they were going to do, that people were no longer joining political parties, that people were no longer following what the politicians said in their speeches, that levels of trust in politics were plummeting. There is a very, very famous downward graph of trust in terms of politicians from the beginning of the 20th century through until the 1990s. So politicians are saying, well, wait a moment, we are in a weaker position in terms of our distance from the electorate than ever before, and here is this new technology, can it do something for us? And then at the same time, there was quite rightly a growing lack of confidence within governments everywhere in the face of growing complexity and risk. Governments are right to feel this. Governments are right to face the fact that for the first time ever, governments of our generation are mainly dealing with problems that previous governments have never dealt with. For all of the political history that I can think back through the 19th and 20th century, governments are elected to essentially do better what governments before them had done less well. Unemployment, health, education, policing. Suddenly you have, facing most governments in the world, elements of risk and uncertainty that they know nothing about. They don't understand what's happening to the global environment and to climate. They don't understand what's happening in terms of pandemics. They don't understand what's happening in terms of the drug culture and the fact that a significant section of the population are now dependent upon drugs in order to keep them in a state outside of disorder. They don't understand how to deal with economic crises that are coming in completely new forms at the moment from the forms that we expected from the early 19th century through to the 1930s. And for all of these reasons, governments are increasingly saying, look, we don't know the answer, maybe somebody out there knows the answer. Maybe within the population there is an element of expertise that we can turn to. And I think the turning point in Britain, incidentally, was a very important report. Every student should be aware of it if you're looking at British politics. In 1967, and it was called the Skeffington Report. And it was a report about the future of planning in Britain, where Skeffington, member of the House of Lords, looked at this situation and said, we don't know. Governments can never make the right decision. The only sensible way to plan anything is to allow people to make decisions about what's going on in their own neighbourhoods and their own backyards. He wasn't saying that because he was a great Democrat. He was saying that because governments gave up on being able to come up with authoritative answers on their own. So one saw an emerging culture within governments all over the world of consultation and what increasingly became known in political administration theory as co-production. Co-production being the assumption that the real legitimacy for any policy decision is that people affected by it have had some say in forming that by which they are affected. Okay? And governments all over the world were divided, really, by the late 1990s between the modernising governments that were adapting to this notion of consultation and the really backward, out there dinosaur governments that didn't ask people questions. And this began to be recognised, and most importantly, I think, it was recognised in a very important report in 2001 by the OECD, which is called Citizens as Partners. And this is what it says: democratic governments are under pressure to adopt a new approach to policy making, one which places greater emphasis on citizen involvement, both upstream and downstream, to decision making. And I was part of this report's, one of this report's authors, and I was part of the discussion that went on with governments in Canada, in Australia, in several European countries, all of whom were saying there's no question that this is the future of government. We have to talk to people, we have to have consultative mechanisms. The question is, how do we do it, and how might we use new technologies to do it efficiently and perhaps inexpensively? That was our concern. Where were the academics during all of this? As usual, they were sitting with their heads in their hands, getting worried, saying on the one hand this and on the other hand that. So academics tended to dichotomise the situation, and they became divided between what were commonly referred to as the cyber optimists and the cyber pessimists. This is a rather silly term invented by an academic called Pippa Norris at Harvard. The cyber optimists amongst the academics were saying, look, surely the internet has a scope for getting us out of this mess of a political system that seems not to listen to anyone. And the cyber pessimists were saying, no, all that's going to happen with the internet is it will replicate the same structural deficiencies of traditional politics. That was the essential argument, and there was an enormous amount of debate about it. The problem with that debate, I now think, looking back on it, having participated in it, having read most of the literature published within it over a decade, is that the theoretical arguments largely ignored political theory. Most of the arguments about the role of the internet didn't go back to basic questions about what is democratic representation? What's it for? Why do we have it? What's it supposed to do? What can it not possibly achieve? And most of the empirical studies were simply unmindful of history. They tended to start with the internet and finish with the internet, rather than go back over a much longer period of time and try to place the internet within a wider scheme of things. So my own approach to the kind of questions I've been talking about is rooted in the theory of political representation. Look, why do we have political representation? We have political representation because citizens cannot be present at the point of decision making when all decisions are made. Representation is a representation of the absent people. So representation happens because somebody has to speak for those who are not going to speak and act for themselves. Traditionally, for a very long time, the opposition has been between two theories of democracy. One of them we call direct democracy. Some people associate it with ancient Greece. Sometimes you think about it in relation to modern Swiss local politics. Direct democracy, everybody votes on every decision that affects them. Problem with direct democracy, takes too long. Not everybody wants to be involved. Not everybody will be involved. Running a complex society doesn't lend itself to all of the pressures of direct democracy. Contrasted with direct democracy, indirect representation. Indirect representation, we vote every few years, we send somebody to a parliament, they speak for us. If we don't like what they're doing, we get rid of them. And so it goes on with an increasing cycle of cynicism. My question, and this is a question that I've worked on for most of my academic career, is could democratic representation be made more direct? In other words, is it possible to take from direct democracy some of the good things, which is that people affected by decisions are involved in making those decisions? That you don't just wait for the decision to be made, but at the point of forming the policy, you involve people. So you have this popular notion of people being engaged in the decision-making, but you still have representatives to do, if you like, the complex and time-consuming work of aggregating all of those opinions, of pulling together the public conversation that is happening around democracy. So my question is, can we move indirect representation to becoming a little bit nearer to what I would call direct representation, a form of representation where the communication channels are permanently open? This has led me, in my research, to two lines of inquiry. The first is empirical, and I was very lucky. in the 1990s. I wanted an institution to work with to try to understand whether any of this would work. And I chose I was ambitious. I chose an institution, the British Parliament. So I went to the British Parliament and I said, I want to run a number of online internet consultations about policy questions of the kind that you've never asked people about before, and see whether that improves the policies that you arrive at. And they said yes, and we ran a number of them. And on the basis of those, we have a very large amount of data, and that data tells us a number of things. It tells us that people want to tell their own stories, that they are prepared to deliberate about policy issues, that they want their representatives to listen to them and be aware of their own experiences, and that the internet is, at least potentially, if used well and managed and designed in the right way, a space in which some of that communication can happen effectively, with a lot of qualifications, many qualifications. Theoretically, this led to the interrogation of the representative relationship and to a number of works. My work, called Direct Representation, I think had a big effect on a number of governments during the beginning of the 21st century, who began to ask some very practical questions about how this new communicative relationship might work. And my book, The Internet and Democratic Citizenship, written with Jay Blumler, has elaborated some of those questions. That's the context. It's a very inadequate summary of the context, but it's a summary of the historical and discursive context. And you can ask me more about that historical and discursive context so that I give a much more qualified and measured and nuanced view than the one I've been able to give you thus far. I now want to move on to talk about the coalition government. What is this coalition government? 2010, we've had a period where Labour had been in power in Britain since 1997. 13 years of a single Labour government losing office, election. The Conservatives do not win, as they had hoped to, but they can only win by forming a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats accept a deal whereby they go into coalition government. Labour becomes the opposition. The coalition are there. That's the government we have now. That's the government which, in a very indirect sense, runs this university. Nick Clegg, who became the Deputy Prime Minister because he was a leader of the junior partner in that coalition, the Liberal Democrats, makes a speech. I think it's a very peculiar speech. He says this government is going to be unlike any other. Some people these days would say that with a certain wry expression on their face. But this government is going to be unlike any other. This government is going to transform our politics so the state has far less control over you and you have far more control over the state. This government is going to break up concentrations of power and hand power back to people, because that is quite simply how we can build a society that is fair. We'll do something no government ever has. We will ask you which laws you think should go. Wow, I want to live under that government. I'm waiting for that government. Oh, we've got that government. Okay, let's just take a step back and see where all of this comes from. JeremyHunt, he was the Conservative opposition minister who was in charge of talking about participation in the internet before the 2010 election. And Hunt says, the internet is not simply about the decentralising of information, it is about the decentralising of power. We ignore this at our peril because it has already started to happen. And he then talks about an example. The Labour government had a petition online from nearly 2 million people wanting them to abandon a policy regarding charging people to travel down certain roads, and it did abandon it. And Hunt says, this is the way politics needs to be in future. First of all, we've got to listen to people. Secondly, we've got to use the internet to do it. That's what he says. This is David Cameron. It's almost poetical. The internet turns lonely fights into mass campaigns. transforms moans into movements, excites the attention of hundreds, thousands, millions of people, and stirs them to action. And constantly accelerating technology makes information infinitely more powerful. By harnessing the wisdom of the crowd, we can find out what information individuals think will be important in holding the state to account. This is a statement. Now, unless we are to arrive at a point where we say anything that any politician says is, as a matter of course, not ever going to be true, we have to work on the assumption that this is what David Cameron was thinking as leader of the opposition. There's some new way of getting people's voices into the process. How are they going to do it? JeremyHunt, 30th of December 2009, just before the election, he launches a competition and he says, if we win the election, we Conservatives, we're going to give £1 million to any group of people who can come up with a piece of technology that will be able to gather together the views of people in an intelligent fashion so that we, the government, will be able to act on those views. It might have been a bizarre promise. It might have been a promise that he shouldn't have made. It might have been a wonderful promise and a real opportunity to do something radically different. What's interesting is indeed it's never happened. And here we have the Conservative Party 2010 General Election Manifesto, the most important statement that any political party puts out about what it's going to do. In the post-bureaucratic age, new technologies make it easier than ever before to involve the public in the legislative process and harness the wisdom of crowds to improve legislation and spot potential problems before a bill is implemented. This is a big society approach to improving legislation. The public reading stage for legislation will take place after the second reading stage, before the bill goes to public bill committees for deliberation. This would give the public a chance to feed in their comments on proposed legislation. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that all of these things were promised, and something then happens. The Conservatives are elected as the senior party in the coalition government. The Liberal Democrats, who say this is going to be a government more democratic than any previous government, are elected as part of the coalition. And indeed, they do something. They set up something, I don't know how many of you have seen this or heard about it, called the Spending Review. It's an online platform, it's still there, any of you can go to it. I have a PhD student who's been working on it, analysing every single piece of evidence that has gone onto it, in which you, members of the public, any member of the public, anywhere, without registering, without proving who you are, can go on there and say to the government, this is how we think you should cut spending. And the government says, we're going to listen to people, we're going to listen to the ideas that come in. It might be a very local idea, we can do this differently in this area, that's a good idea for doing something in another area that will help to save money. And as a consequence of this, we will start to act upon it. What happened after the first year of this online spending review was that the government announced that it had received 25 ideas from the public. And I want to tell you two ideas that were not amongst those 25 ideas. One of them was increasing tuition fees for students. Not one of all the people who went on the spending review said, we've got a good idea for raising more money. Charge students £25,000 to do a degree. Not one of them, out of all of the many people who went on there, came up with the idea of privatising or marketising the provision of health suppliers for the National Health Service. Both of those decisions were then made as policy by the government. So they made these policy decisions without either of them having been in the manifesto of either of the two coalition parties, and without either of them having come through the spending review. And if any of you want to see a detailed account of those two policies and their relationship to the online spending review, you can read an article that I wrote about it in the Political Quarterly Journal. I want to suggest to you that what we have seen in relation to this government and in relation to the online spending review and in relation to its promises of listening to people is a pathology of a listening government. What do I mean when I use the word pathology? I mean we have actually seen an example of something demonstrated through how far it doesn't represent what it is supposed to demonstrate. The pathology of a great opera singer would be a person who's lost their voice, couldn't sing in the first place, and is too scared to go out on the stage. That would be a pathology of an opera singer. The pathology of a listening government is a government that is utilising the technology, setting up competitions to create more sophisticated technology for listening, talking a great deal about listening, engaging in a rhetorical exercise which bases its democratic legitimacy upon listening, but which actually, at every level, only demonstrates any of those things by not doing them. So I wonder whether we might say that what governments need to think about, not just this coalition government in Britain, and not just governments in Britain, and not just national governments, but local and global regional governments, is how do governments listen? I mean, what does it mean to listen? Here is something that John Prescott, former Deputy Prime Minister of Britain, said. Conversation means you have a two-way exchange. You ask the question, and I answer it. It's called conversation. I don't think that's a very good definition of conversation. The idea of the conversation being one in which, for example, I constantly ask you questions, you tell me what you think, and we both go away, may not involve any kind of listening or any kind of conversation. I think John Dryzek, the great Australian political theorist, puts it very astutely when he says, the most effective and insidious way to silence others in politics is a refusal to listen. That is to say, the most important thing you can do to someone if you really want them to become irrelevant to politics, if you want to nullify them, if you want to put them in a position of insignificance, is not to ask them, is not to lock them up, but it's to continually allow them to talk to you in a fashion that will have absolutely no effect upon you. But I also think I agree with Nick Couldry in his book Why Voice Matters, when he says governments cannot any longer say that they don't hear. And that's a very, very important point. Despite their determination not to listen, the technologies of listening and hearing are now so pervasive that it is almost impossible for governments not to hear even that which they do not want to hear. And that's a position we're in. Very briefly, 2 or 3 technological approaches to listening. One of them that we've done a lot of work on in my own research centre at the University of Leeds is called computer-supported argument visualisation, or argument mapping. This is based upon the assumption that you can take discourse from hundreds of thousands or indeed tens of millions of people, and rather than having to read through all of it, you can organise it in such a way that it represents preferences and values, almost like a weather map might represent the climate. And if any of you care to look at any of these sites, the Policy Commons is the one that we've produced, you'll see some examples of how we've taken very complex political arguments involving multi-perspectival discourses and put them in a position where you can show them to people and demonstrate what people are arguing about. And the rationale for this was put by the great philosopher and founder of a lot of this, Horst Rittel, who says, current communication tools and methods force the crafting of complex arguments